All right, so keto, carnivore, everyone's talking about them, but what's the real deal? We're taking a deep dive into those today, and we're tapping into the expertise of Dr. Ken Berry for this one. He's a family physician, been in practice for 20 years, and he's got a really interesting take on these popular diets.
Yeah, what struck me about Dr. Berry's approach is that he doesn't really see keto and carnivore as being at odds with each other.
Oh, not like a this or that kind of thing.
Exactly. He views them more as different tools in a toolbox, each with its own purpose and place.
I like that, the toolbox analogy. But instead of hammers and wrenches, we're talking, what, keto coffee and ribeye steaks?
You're getting warmer with the ribeye.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Berry wants us to think about our carbohydrate intake like a volume knob, on a stereo system.
Okay, I'm visualizing.
So keto, he says, is like turning that carb knob way, way down. And carnivore, that's practically hitting the mute button on carbs altogether.
So less bread, more meat, got it. But that almost sounds too simple, doesn't it? Like, is it really that straightforward?
Well, Dr. Berry really emphasizes the importance of keeping things simple. And that's reflected in his focus on whole, single-ingredient foods. He's all about a plain steak over a keto protein bar with a list of ingredients a mile long.
Yeah, ditch the processed stuff, embrace real food, back to basics, makes sense. But I'm still curious about this whole carb knob idea. Why is it such a big deal? What's so important about carbohydrates anyway?
Well, to really understand that, we need to delve into the world of inflammation. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so less processed junk, more real food. I think we can all get on board with that. But what's the actual connection between turning down the carb knob, as Dr. Berry calls it, and improving our health? I know he talked about inflammation, right?
He did, and it's actually a really crucial part of his whole approach. He talks about how so many health issues we grapple with today, and I'm talking everything from joint pain to gut problems to even skin conditions, often stem from this underlying chronic inflammation.
Okay, so when he says chronic inflammation, he doesn't just mean like being a little sore after hitting the gym, right?
Exactly. He's really careful to make that distinction. This isn't about the temporary inflammation your body experiences after a workout or an injury. He's talking about what he calls inappropriate inflammation, the kind that just lingers and lingers in the background like a low hum, creating all sorts of problems under the surface.
Wow, that's a little unnerving when you put it that way. I'm definitely feeling more mindful of my snack choices right about now. But I am curious, where do keto and carnivore fit into all of this? Do they actually help reduce that kind of inflammation?
That's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? And this is where keto and carnivore, while both focused on reducing carbs, start to take slightly different paths. Dr. Berry explains that some people transition to a ketogenic way of eating, and they just thrive. They're loving their greens, maybe snacking on some nuts, and they see amazing improvements.
Right, right.
But then there's another group, and for these individuals, those very foods, the greens, the nuts, they actually seem to trigger inflammation. And that's when Dr. Berry might suggest exploring a more carnivore approach.
Carnivore as in no plants at all. That seems pretty drastic.
It's definitely a big change, no doubt about it. But what Dr. Berry has observed is that for some people, cutting out plant foods entirely can be like hitting the reset button on their system. By removing all potential triggers, at least for a period of time, the body has a chance to calm that inflammation down and, in some cases, even begin to heal. And he's got some really interesting patient stories in his book that illustrate this.
Okay, so how do you even know if you're someone who needs to hit that reset button? Like, how do you figure out if ditching plant foods is something you should even consider?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll unpack in the next part.
So we're talking about really tuning in and figuring out what works best for your body.
Right, and it's not always easy, but
especially when you're dealing with more complex health issues.
Yep.
Like Dr. Berry also talks about autoimmune conditions.
Yeah.
And that just feels like a whole other level.
It is.
Because now we're talking about your body, your immune system actually turning against you.
Yeah, it's like your body's defense system kind of going a little haywire.
Right.
It's not recognizing your own tissues, your own organs, and it starts attacking them like they're the enemy.
And that's where you get into things like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, type 1 diabetes, Crohn's disease. I mean, we're talking serious stuff.
Absolutely. And these conditions, they can really impact your quality of life.
And this is where it gets really interesting because Dr. Berry talks about how a ketogenic diet can be helpful for people with autoimmune conditions.
Oh, right.
But then he takes it a step further with the carnivore approach.
Yeah. And that's where, for some people, it's like, whoa, hold on a minute. This is getting a little intense.
Yeah, I mean, are we saying that anyone with an autoimmune condition should just give up all plant foods?
Well, and Dr. Berry, he's careful about that. He doesn't necessarily advocate for a lifelong, strict carnivore approach for everyone with an autoimmune disease.
Right.
But what he does suggest is trying it as a kind of reset.
Okay, like a reset button.
Exactly.
Food the system.
He talks about like a 90-day experiment where you really commit to animal-based foods only.
Okay.
And the idea is that this eliminates the vast majority of potential triggers.
You're really stripping it down to the bare bones.
Exactly. And it gives your body a chance to, to calm down, to potentially heal.
Right, because if you're constantly bombarding your system with things that are triggering this inflammatory response,
Exactly.
it's never going to get a chance to kind of settle down.
Exactly. It's like, you're trying to put out a fire, but you keep adding more fuel to it.
Right, exactly.
You got to remove the fuel source.
So 90 days, strict carnivore, and then what?
That's when the real detective work begins.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
So after that reset period, that's when you start slowly, and I mean slowly, reintroducing foods.
Wait, one at a time.
One at a time, exactly.
And really paying attention.
Exactly. Like we were saying earlier, you become a detective, you're observing, how does your body respond? Do you notice any changes? And then based on that information, you can start to personalize your approach.
So it becomes less about following a rigid set of rules and more about this ongoing conversation with your own body.
Precisely.
It seems like at its core, Dr. Berry's approach is really about empowering people with knowledge.
Absolutely.
It's about giving you the tools and the information to become an active participant in your own health journey.
Yeah, it's not about him saying, do this, do that.
Yeah.
It's about saying, here's what I've observed, here's what I've learned. Now you go and figure out what works best for you.
And I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of keto and carnivore to the importance of reducing inflammation and listening to your body.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and if there's one key takeaway I hope you walk away with, it's that finding the right dietary approach is an individual journey.
Definitely.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution. So keep exploring, keep experimenting, and most importantly, keep that conversation going with your body.
Because it knows best.
It does, it does. All right, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.